Hello, my name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. And with me, as always, James Green from Brown University and from the Brazil Office Alliance. Hi, James. How are you?
Great to see you today, Gustavo. I'm fine, thank you.
So last time we spoke, we talked about Lula's visit to Washington and how he had a productive meeting with Donald Trump. Remember back then that we said that this was good news for Brazil-US relations, but that it didn't mean much because of how unpredictable the Trump White House is. And boy, we were spot on, because a few weeks later, the other shoe dropped, and the U.S. State Department designated the Comando Vermelho, or the Red Command, and the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the first command of the capital, or as we call in Brazil, the PCC, as specially designated global terrorists. And so these are now foreign terrorist organizations. This label will take effect on June the 5th. And Rubio reaffirmed something that the U.S. government had said already over the years, that these are the two of the most violent criminal organizations in Brazil and in the world, with networks that reach into the U.S. Now, James, this decision blindsided Brazil in a way, not because Brazil was unaware that this could happen, but because it found out that it was made official not by a bilateral cable or by a diplomatic notice, but through social media, when Rubio published that on his X account. How do you read the designation, especially because it came just a couple of days after Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, Lula's main challenger in the October election? He visited with Trump, then he met with Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance. So how do you see these events that unfolded last week?
So many people think that Trump carries a brilliant three-dimensional chess all the time, and everything he does is filled with tremendously intelligent maneuvers. I think that's not what's going on here. I think we have a very complex situation in which, on one hand, Trump needs to be loved by people around the world, whether it's North Korea or Brazil. Lula has a charismatic personality, and so he kind of responded very positively to that and got a reduction in the question of tariffs, which is irrelevant now because the tariffs have been declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. But I think there's another game playing, which is Marco Rubio's, and what his intentions are. So Marco Rubio's family were Cuban Americans who migrated to the United States before the revolution, but he is very, very much part of the Cuban American community in Florida, which is very hostile towards the regime, and would love to use the situation to change the government of Cuba to a pro-American government, and use that as a way for his path towards the White House, which is one of his intentions clearly in the future. He was a candidate in 2016. He was abused by Trump, but he has no principles, and therefore he later decided to join the government and be the Secretary of State. And clearly he is the person who's articulating these questions behind the scenes. I think Trump gets brought into the loop on given moments because he has a different kind of response to things, whereas the machinations are happening in the State Department with Rubio. And I'm going to go back to this other part of the question that you asked in a minute, but I think it's really important to understand that a lot of what's going on is really connected to a strategy to bring down the Cuban government. And so if you can weaken Brazil, if you can weaken Mexico, if you can weaken Colombia, which are the three progressive governments, and we'll see what happens in Colombia with the elections, the possibility of not having defenders of Cuba in Latin America. So, what this means, it means that Flavio does have access to the people in the White House and in the State Department, and he has those channels. And he did this in a desperate attempt to change the discourse, change the story based on all the accusations about corruption with the Masters Bank scandal and the film that is being made for his father, in homage of his father. And I think this was somewhat successful, but I think the problem is that the Bolsonaro family is so interlinked with corruption and problems that this is just going to be one problem after another hitting the campaign. And so, whereas we could say that 2 weeks ago, after Lula's visit, that there was a boost in the polls and the possibility of his really forging ahead, I think that's still the situation, although some of the polls are saying a little differently now, that Lula's advantage has kind of diminished again. That nevertheless, the Flavio Bolsonaro campaign is extremely weak, and it's going to continue to be weak. And so it's a very interesting dynamic we have, without discounting the fact that there is still a very hardcore base of 30% of the Brazilian population that is in favor of Bolsonaro, will support Bolsonaro, whatever happens.
Right, and I want to talk a little bit about the consequences for Brazil, because, I mean, just for people who are not very familiar with the PCC and the Red Command, these are organizations that indeed use many tactics that terrorist organizations also deploy. However, according to the Brazilian legislation, these are not to be considered terrorist organizations because they are driven by profit and not by ideological motivation. So that was why the Brazilian government has always opposed to that. That was why even a Congress that is dominated by the right has not moved ahead with this push to designate these organizations as terrorists. And however, this is a big political trap for Lula, because already the left is seen as soft on crime. The left is seen as always trying to argue about the structural causes of violence, but not actually tackling its effects on society. And we're talking about a country in Brazil where 94% of people believe that the city they live in is violent, and less than half feel safe in their own neighborhood. So violence is a top of mind issue for Brazilian voters. And anything that you say against the designation of terrorists for criminal organizations that exert territorial control and that make life a living hell for many Brazilians can be framed disingenuously as it is, but can be framed as complicit with these organizations. And that is what the Bolsonaro camp has tried to do about the Lula administration, which I think that explains why when Lula reacted to the designation, I mean, we could see a big change in tone. He said, we will not be treated as brats, we will not be treated as a banana republic. But then he said, these organizations act as terrorists for the populations that they affect. So this is Lula trying not to step on the banana peel that this designation lays down for him, but is a very tight needle to thread, right?
I'm not sure he did a very good job in the first attempt at this. I think I understand the intent, which is to say, look, we're hard on crime also. We want to diminish the terrorism. The other argument that was made is when Bolsonaro was in power for 4 years, they did nothing against these two organizations. Why are they interested in it now? Has there been a real significant difference in their actions in Brazil to justify this campaign now, as opposed to when Bolsonaro was in charge of the government and had the access to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it is still very hard. And it's a little confusing for people to say, well, wait a minute, if we consider PCC and Comando Vermelho to be terrorist organizations in the context of Brazil, are acting as if they were, why are we rejecting this designation internationally? And the reason, and it's a very good one, is that the United States, under this administration, you could argue under others, has no respect for national sovereignty of other nations. They just do what they want to do. The fact that over 200 boats have been destroyed, or people have been killed in small crafts off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia with no due process in any way, shape, or form, just assuming because it's a small craft that it's going to be smuggling in drugs, is an example of that. And the other problem we have here is that although it was implicitly involved in the actions in Venezuela to go against the president and to deport him. And now we see, and this is why I talk about Cuba, the fact that this last week, Raul Castro, 94 years old, is being accused of being responsible for the killing of the downing of airplanes of Cuban Americans who were assisting people who were trying to leave the country. They flew over Cuban territory and said they were shot down. To accuse Raul Castro of this when he's 94 is it's a provocation to set up justifications. So I think the people that are concerned about that are really concerned about what the State Department under Trump will do to affirm the power of the United States in Latin America and affirm not the Monroe Doctrine, but the Trump document, or the Dunroe document for Latin America, which is basically the United States wants to revert to a very traditional relationship to Latin America, a neocolonial power, deciding the fate of countries, intervening when it's necessary, doing what it needs to do for its own narrow national interest. So that's the concern Brazilians have, and it's going to be hard for the Workers' Party campaign, I think, to find the path, because they've not been as successful in the past of finding the path to respond to the question of violence and crime in Brazil. On the other hand, and I think this has to do with the dynamic of the electoral race and our analysis of the elections, that Flavio Bolsonaro is grasping at straws, and I think that it's a sign of the weakness of his campaign, but he's not out of the running, and many things could happen in the next 5 months before the elections. And as an historian of Brazil, I know that anything can happen at any time in the history of the country. It's very hard to predict anything. So to say who is the likely winner, to say what the outcome is going to be, is still very early, I think, in the game to figure out what's going on.
Right. And I mean, one thing that I think it's also important when we're talking about this designation is that many of the people who fight these organizations, and some of whom have been given death sentences by the PCC and by the Red Command, they are against the designation because they say that it will hamper cooperation efforts between Brazilian law enforcement authorities and U.S. law enforcement authorities. They're saying that cooperation that now goes through the FBI, this issue now moves to the CIA, which is a very opaque organization which does not share information, because this now becomes a matter of national security for the U.S. government. And there's another very important aspect of this, because now the Brazilian financial system is under immense pressure. We have been covering in the Brazilian Report for years how these criminal organizations have embedded themselves in the legitimate economy. And we have had recent police investigations showing the extent of that involvement of criminal organizations with the legitimate economy, whether we're talking about the fuel trade or investment funds, all kinds of cash businesses that handle cash. They have seen an infiltration of these organizations as a way for them to launder money. And now we have a U.S. statute that is explicitly extraterritorial, putting a lot of pressure on banks, insurers, funds, and multinational companies that, now they have to rethink their supply chains. They have to rethink the way that they operate in Brazil, because any link, knowingly or not, with the PCC or the Red Command may now trigger severe sanctions, because if you have an account holder that is a member of the PCC, you are an institution that is enabling a terrorist organization. And I mean, the PCC and the Red Command, they are only the latest of more than a dozen Latin American gangs who have been deemed as terrorists by the Trump administration. And a report by the website Corporate Compliance Insights says that after several Mexican cartels were designated as terrorist organizations, 3 Mexican financial institutions were pushed out of business because of sanctions. The logistics costs rose between 8 to 12% in Mexico, and trucking insurance increased by up to 30% as firms had to re-audit entire supply chains. Colombia also offers a cautionary tale, because Chiquita brands, once they made payments to sanction militias to avoid physical violence against company personnel and property, because they were located in territories under the domain of criminal organizations. And they ended up having to pay a $25 million criminal fine, and later a fine of almost 40 million in a civil trial that they had to pay in damages to victims of those those militias that were sanctioned.
Right.
So here in Brazil, we have a problem that may even come back to bite the Bolsonaros in the rear end, because the Bolsonaros have been linked to people who are associated with the Red Command. So now, by proxy, some can say that the Bolsonaros are very close to terrorist organizations. And I mean, the Banco Master case that you mentioned, it is a sort of it is at the center of a Venn diagram of every kind of scandal in Brazil right now, and it links politicians, financial institutions to criminal organizations. So now we're in a very precarious position in Brazil in regards to the financial system.
So you're addressing two really crucial questions. One could have a devastating effect on the economy of the country, and this is an effect that would theoretically affect both a new Lula government and 27 or a Bolsonaro government. That's the other question. The second thing is that it's really clear that the Bolsonaro family is linked to the militias in Rio de Janeiro, and in some way. And they're also, I mean, if you're going to start pointing to organizations that extract money from people, you know, and involved in many illicit activities, the militias in Rio are also, you know, connected to that. So it's a very strange thing. I think that it's really an act of desperation of the Bolsonaro camp to do this, because they really run the risk of being caught up in the dragnet themselves and getting more involved. And I think that one direct connection that it could be proven will destroy their campaign. So they're really, I think it's an act of desperation that they're kind of doing these things, and we'll see if what kind of long-term impact it has on the country, and the impact on the elections.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the avenues that the government is trying to pursue when answering to this designation is the impact that this could have on Pix, which is Brazil's instant payment network that was launched in 2020, now accounts for more than half of the transactions in Brazil. We have touched on this on previous episodes. And just so people have a sense of how big Pix is in Brazil, it moves more than 3 trillion reais per month, which is almost 600 billion US dollars, and across over 7 billion transactions a month. If there's one thing that Brazilians like is Pix, is how easy it is to move money. But the problem is gangs also like Pix. They use several fake accounts, shell companies, to wire dirty money through dozens and sometimes hundreds of accounts in order to cover their tracks. So they are very active on Pix. And what the finance ministry in Brazil said is that maybe if one big institution that is systemically relevant for the Pix network is caught under US sanctions, that could start to create holes in the Pix network and really hamper the system. So, I mean, last year when the Trump administration triggered a series of measures against Brazil, supposedly as a retaliation for the trial of Jair Bolsonaro for attempting a coup after the 2022 election, one of these moves against Brazil was opening a trade investigation against Pix, saying that Pix was an unfair system that hampered U.S. card operators Visa and MasterCard.
No, it's really funny. When I lived in Brazil many years ago, didn't have a credit card. And when I went back to the United States, I didn't really know how to use a credit card. And I got into a huge debt because I liked the idea of having access to consumer items. And that's one of the biggest problems of Brazilians. The greatest financial problem or economic problem for many people is actually the huge indebtedness, not just credit cards, but other things, off betting and other kinds of activities which really contribute to people's indebtedness. But this is really serious, and I think Brazil has some of the highest interest rates in the world in credit cards. Not that PIX resolves that question, because it really is a transfer of money, but many people find that as a very more efficient way to kind of do financial transactions, especially for poor people who want to try to avoid falling into the trap of credit cards or bank loans that are going to be really expensive. If they can have other ways to operate with their money, they prefer that. So it's a serious question, and really could undermine in a big way many financial institutions which rely on this exploration of interest rates to make huge profits. I mean, just billions of dollars in profits on people's financial instability and their precariousness, and that's a serious question as well. So I'm curious to know what
it's a game changer for retailers too, right? Because it allows them not to pay fees to Visa and MasterCard. Right. So when you go to retail shops in Brazil, there's the regular price, but if you said you're going to pay with PIX, then you get a small discount all the time.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting, in the United States, there are now restaurants who refuse to take credit cards because they don't want to pay the 3% transaction fees. If there were a PIX in the United States that was functioning, it would cause more havoc, I think, on the financial institutions, even in Brazil, because I think millions of people would immediately adopt this new way of paying things. Businesses would appreciate that as well, because it's really just a direct transfer. In just a few seconds, the money is out of your account to another account. But you're right, it opens the door for this abuse, which is the pretext that the United States is doing. And it's really about, in my mind, Trump's desire to have a greater influence in Latin America. And in this regard, if I may take a bigger look at this situation, the fact that Trump is unable to negotiate a settlement in Iran, to find a strategy which allows him to leave claiming some kind of victory when there's no victory that has been achieved at all the more makes me concerned about how that the government is going to transfer their attentions towards Latin America in the next period. And I think that if the Republicans suffer a huge defeat and lose control of the House and even the Senate, then it really runs the risk that Trump, in response to prove his virility, his importance, his masculinity, his predominance, will very likely become much more aggressive in his politics in Latin America, incentivized by Marco Rubio, and the possibility, therefore, of interventions, not interventions, direct military interventions in Brazil. That's not going to happen in my mind, but other kinds of ways of influencing politics in the Americas. And it's a real danger. And I think I think people were a little caught off guard by how well Lula managed to be received by Trump and assume that all things had passed and there weren't going to be problems. And I don't think that Trump has given up on his desire to endorse his candidates and make a big point of that. And at some point, I'm still convinced he's going to endorse Flavio Bolsonaro, which is one of the reasons why there's a delegation of members of Congress, Brazilian Congress, in Washington this week, talking to the U.S. Congress about the Brazilian elections and actually making an appeal for no intervention of the U.S. government in any way, shape, or form in trying to influence the elections or in other kinds of interference in Brazil's life. It's an initiative that the Washington Brazil office has been working on to bring Congress people from Brazil to the U.S. Congress to have this dialogue, for people to understand the situation in Brazil, the reality of that, and encourage U.S. politicians to have a very appropriate position of non-intervention, non-interference in Brazilian domestic affairs, just as the United States would prefer not to have other countries interfering in its election affairs.
Now, one thing that, to your point about Trump's influence over Latin America, that I think is important, is to talk a little bit about the ideological landscape, especially in South America. So we have seen, and I think it's a mix of two things. One, the electorate is shifting towards the right a little bit. And also there's a big anti-incumbency bias here in the region. We have seen shifts towards the right or the hard right, in Chile with Jose Antonio Cast. Now in Colombia, just on Sunday, we saw Abelardo de la Espriella, a Trump-like candidate or a Milei-like candidate, reaching the runoff ahead of the left-wing candidate Ivan Cepeda. We have Javier Milei in Argentina. We have Rodrigo Paz, who is not a hard right guy, but has the sympathy of the White House. So we're starting to
Bukele
see
in
an
El Salvador
ideological.
also. Bukele in
Exactly,
El Salvador also. Yeah.
exactly. Even in Guatemala, we have Arevalo going more mano dura on the security end in order to still gather political support. So we're seeing an ideological map of Latin America that is becoming increasingly more hostile to politicians like Lula. And I mean, let's remember Lula during his first terms between 2003 and 2010, he wanted Brazil to be this kind of regional leader. And that seems like a goal that is becoming increasingly less likely to be achievable because of the fact that, one, I think leaders here, they seek solutions elsewhere, either in China for trade or in the US for political backing. And also because ideologically, they are so far apart right now.
You're absolutely right about that situation, and I think I mean we do have a panorama in Latin America in which Mexico and the Colombian results yesterday were interesting because the difference between the far right candidate and the left was very small. It was like 2 or 3 points, and I don't think anyone expected that a while ago. I think there's been actually the left is stronger than was anticipated after the Pietro government. And then we have little Uruguay and we have Brazil, and so I think that the big things are at stake for the future and the future of the continent in the next period. And if we keep into consideration that Trump clearly is interested in leaving his mark everywhere possible in the next 2.5 years, 2 years and 4 months, 5 months, and I think he's very, very much interested in being able to claim he did some regime change that was legitimate. So he's going to try legitimate in the sense that he actually does it, as opposed to say he does it. And so I think the big question is going to be whether he's going to try to do that in Cuba, what he's going to be able to do to influence the Brazilian elections, the pressure that they're putting on Mexico, which makes it extremely difficult for the president of Mexico to kind of survive in this terrain, being so close to the United States. And so it's a real challenge for progressive forces in Latin America in this moment. And it's not as if the problems of the world have been solved or going to necessarily be solved by the far right. They're offering alternatives which aren't necessarily overcoming any of the strategic problems that Latin America faces. So I think that it makes the elections in Brazil all the more crucial for the future of the region over the immediate future.
And one thing that is quite unique about this situation is how volatile the scenario is. Because a month and a half ago, people were saying Brazil, well, the Lula administration is already a lame duck administration. A couple of weeks later, Flávio Bolsonaro saw himself at the center of a corruption affair, linked, being caught on tape asking for $10 million from a corrupt banker. And then everybody said, well, his candidacy is going to crash and burn. Then a couple of weeks later, now with this designation, Flávio has the upper hand and Lula is in the rope. So every couple of weeks, we have a very different scenario. And I mean, I think we're going to see this kind of volatile scenario until October, when we're going to see an election that is going to be very tightly contested in the same modes as we saw in 2022 or 2014.
No, I would agree with you. I think it's going to be a very narrow election result between the main candidates. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about the emergence of the attempts for the emergence of what is known in Brazil's third way, candidates that are trying to differentiate themselves from the far right on one hand, and also from the coalition that Lula will organize and present in the elections. And I'm not seeing the traction that they have, but they're trying to build this alternative candidacy of several people, including former candidate for president Aécio Neves, which has announced that he is intending to run for office again, which I think is very bizarre. How are you taking this third? Is the third way really out of the gate? It's not going to go anywhere, or is it going to get some distance in the race?
I don't think the third way is going to make big waves this year. So for people who are not following Brazilian politics that closely, we have very far ahead from the pack Lula, a left-wing president, Flávio Bolsonaro, a far-right challenger, and then a bunch of candidates who want to be, as James says, the third way, which are pretty much right-wing candidates. Because when we say a third way, it would be a centrist guy with characteristics from both sides of the aisle, but actually it's people with their both feet in the right-wing canoe, and but just trying to brand themselves differently from the Bolsonaros, and
hoping that Bolsonaro will sink. And that's the other part. That's the other part of this thing, is they're putting themselves out there, hoping that he'll sink, and then they can move in to take his spot.
Yeah, and I mean these are notably former Goiás Governor Ronaldo Caiado, former Minas Gerais Governor Romeu Zema, and these candidates, until very recently, they were in a brown-nosing contest to see who was the biggest Bolsonaro sycophant, in order to try to, they hoped that with Bolsonaro in jail, Bolsonaro would anoint one of them as his successor, and actually he anointed his eldest son. But I don't see them moving ahead, because I think one of the biggest problems with this so-called third way is that, I mean, say what you want about Lula or Bolsonaro, but these are the only two politicians that actually do the grassroots efforts. Bolsonaro, for years, he went to the churches every weekend, every Sunday, trying to get a social base. And Lula, with the history of his party, with the unions, with the social movements. So these are the only two people that actually do politics 365 days a year, whereas we have these other politicians who appear every 4 years, and just because there is a big chunk of the electorate who doesn't like Lula or Bolsonaro, they think that it's automatically going their way. However, I do think that there's one candidate that we should keep our eyes on, and I think that he's doing something that is very noteworthy, which is Renan Santos. He is the presidential candidate for the Missão Party, a party that is I heard some people comparing them to the AfD in Germany. Very problematic beliefs. And I think that he has always positioned himself as a hard right anti-Bolsonarista, which already sets him apart from the pack. He has criticized the Bolsonaros since before it was cool, and he has a way of putting up his political ideology that I find both very interesting as a political observer and very concerning, because he has a very structured reasoning to show the inefficiency of the Brazilian state, of problems with voter behavior in parts of the country, but he does that in a way that pretty much filled with dog whistles to say that people from the richer areas are first-class citizens and people from the poor areas are second-class citizens. I'm trying to simplify what he says, but I think that he's doing this grassroots effort not for 2026 but for 2030, right. And I think he's going to emerge as a big figure in the right.
I mean, the question is really whether Flavio Bolsonaro manages to stay in the race with surviving all the corruption, this current corruption scandal, and then others that might potentially emerge. And if he does, then do other people move in, or are they able to do that? Or if he stays in the race, to what extent these other far-right candidates running again, for the future, because they want to put their name out there. In the case of Aécio Neves, it's just a bizarre vanity, I guess, on his part, because I think he has no chance in the world getting anywhere. But the question is whether this affects the outcome of the main candidates. In other words, does this divide the vote on the right? Does this in any way help the possibility of Lula winning on the first round? If he has a majority of votes, there's not a second round. That happened under Cardoso twice, but not on any other candidate. All the other candidates' races have been two
rounds.
2 rounds. Thank you. I was thinking in Portuguese. So I think that's another question that we have here. To what extent these are going to be people that are going to, and then are these people that after they're frustrated with their candidate not winning, are they going to stay at home and pay the little tiny fine to not vote, because voting is obligatory in Brazil?
You don't even have to do that. You can justify your absence through an app, so you don't even have to pay the few couple of reais as a fine.
Yeah, so it's such a tiny. I think someone just recently paid it. They paid 14 reais for not having voted. Maybe it was $14. But so I think this is the other question. Does this have any? Does the divisions and disputes? Because as you say, these are not centrist candidates. These are not people looking for. And the people who pretended to be centrist candidates, even people like Eduardo Leite, from the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, who was a candidate and then he withdrew in the last term, kind of throwing his name out there again. It's the far right. It's people on the hard right that are disputing with Bolsonaro. Again, seeing blood and the possibility of his coming down and they're being able to occupy that space. So we'll see. It's not clear to me what the result of these other candidates' participation in the race will be for the final first round, and what happens that night, as they quickly, unlike the United States, know what the outcome and the results are. But we'll see.
Well, we'll be commenting live on that, so it's going to be interesting, an interesting election day. But I personally think that Flávio Bolsonaro's floor is just too high for anyone to challenge his position as the main anti-Lula candidate. I do think that if Flávio continues to be hit by scandal, that may actually turn off part of his coalition, and people may not even show up to vote. But I just think the gap between him and the rest of the pack is just too high for someone to leapfrog him and face Lula in a potential.
Except for Michelle Bolsonaro, who is against the Bolsonaro's third wife, and a person who does not like her stepsons at all, and there's a big fight between them. She's currently a pre-candidate for the senator in the federal district of Brasilia, and is speculated to easily be elected because of her connections to evangelical Christians and links to the communities in which she grew up in the area around Brasilia, and the power of the name Bolsonaro and her popularity. So if Flávio, for whatever reason, were to melt away, as they say in Portuguese, then I think one immediate attempt might be a maneuver to throw Michele to not lose the branding at all. But I don't think even Jair is interested in that possibility.
Yes, that's the problem, because logically, Michele Bolsonaro is the best candidate in the Bolsonaro clan. He's not tarnished by the corruption scandals that both Jair and his sons are. She has an evangelical connection that is far stronger than any of the Bolsonaro brothers. But there is a lack of trust in the clan around her. The stepsons do not trust her. And
she also has a sketchy past, which it'll be very interesting if people decide if she becomes, to what extent that is brought up, and it'll be misogynistic in a certain way that it is brought up. And I hope that the people who decide to do that do it in an intelligent way, because it could be really an ugly thing. But she is tremendously popular among a large sector of the extreme right. But I guess,
He
at
would
this
be
point,
Lula's most formidable challenger.
I think so. I think so. And at this point, Flavio might just limp through to October, or maybe he'll gain in strength, and Lula will stumble. I mean, this could happen. There's no guarantees of anything. I think that's the most interesting and disconcerting situation about the elections, is that anything could happen, and there's no guarantee for the future. And for anyone who lived through the 4 years of Jair Bolsonaro, I think the concern that the country might have to go through a remake. And what we learned from Trump is, on the remake, they learn from the past mistakes and are much more brutal in guaranteeing that what they want, they get. Trump, I think, took him 4 years to figure out how to not be president, and then he's being a kind of president now that is just devastating for the country. And that's the concern I think that many people have, that if Flavio comes to power with a conservative Congress, the possibility of the damage that he could do to the country could just be immense.
Yes. Well, with that, I think that's it for this week's episode. James, thank you very much for always a very stimulating conversation. And I'm sure that next time we're going to speak, probably wacky things will have happened, and the scenario is going to be very different from the one we have described today.
Exactly. It's a never-ending story, a never-ending roller coaster ride, I think, in a certain way. So thank you so much for co-sponsoring this event. This is a wonderful show that we're doing, and it's really wonderful to work with the Brazil Report.
Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Até a próxima. Obrigado.